This is the MEN2 podcast with Scott and Mick. Today, a special episode where we talk about Sweden and socialism.
Hi, I'm Bernie Sanders. I'm running for president. We have political right, freedom of religion, and all of that is enormously important. But you know what we don't have? We don't have guarantees regarding economic rights. When we talk about human freedom and rights, we've got to understand that everybody needs a decent paying job, that people need healthcare, that people need education. And all over the world, these ideas are taking place. You go to countries in Scandinavia, of course, healthcare is a right. Higher education is free. They have strong preschool programs. They make sure that their elderly folks can retire in dignity. These are not radical ideas.
So that was Bernie Sanders, who announced a few weeks ago that
Redline Bernie
is running for president in 2020. And in the 1980s, old mate Bernie claimed the success of socialist countries like the USSR, Cuba and Nicaragua were fine examples of how socialism can work. And he even honeymooned in the USSR in 1988, during which time gulags still existed and political prisoners were still being tortured in so-called psychiatric hospitals. In 2011, Sanders said these days the American dream is more apt to be realised in South America, in places such as Ecuador, Venezuela and Argentina. And we all know those countries are just doing great.
Raving successes. Yeah. Don't you love how he just moves from one failure to the next?
He's still going.
It's like Bernie can actually predict where the next failure is going to be if he says it's wonderful.
Well, the next one's Cuba. And he was praising their healthcare and education system just last year, despite their train wreck of an economy. And since then, he's changed his tune, given all of those countries he mentioned have collapsed.
Well, I guess if you're an American, the good thing is if he keeps saying America's in bad shape and it needs to be fixed and it's horrible, then that's a good indicator that it's probably good.
Do you think he's doing George Costanza opposite?
Yeah, he just
says whatever the opposite I say is, that's the way it's going to be. Yeah. So a few days after Sanders announced his presidential run, Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, tweeted, "Bernie Sanders was lucky to be able to get the Soviet Union in 1988 and praise all of its stunning socialist achievements before the entire system collapsed under the weight of its own spectacular failures." Pretty harsh from old mate Carl. And he's not the only Nordic government leader to get stuck into Bernie. In 2015, Danish Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen, sorry for my butchering of...
I'm sure that was perfect.
Was it Løkke? Løkke?
What, did you say Danish?
He's Danish.
Yeah, I'm sure. I've got some Danish subscribers. They'll write in and tell us.
Really? Okay. Well, I apologise to all of these Danish people. Anyway, old mate Lars, he told Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, "I know that some people in the US associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing very clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy." Mm-hmm. Do you think you needed to be a bit more clear about that? I sort of felt like it's still a bit of a grey area.
Well, obviously the message is not getting through because I actually heard this, the conference I mentioned before, Liberty Fest in the West, just on, one was on Saturday. They said, a young man, this was a good question, a young guy, he would have been of university age, he stood up and he said, look, the socialists on campus today, they don't come out and say that they praise USSR or China or any of these other failed communist regimes. What they do is they point to the Scandinavian countries and say, what about that socialism? That's the type of socialism we want.
Well, that's good because we're going to talk about that specifically. So we decided to take a look at Sweden to see what's going on there and whether it's actually a socialist utopia or it's something else entirely. So how is it that a country of only 10 million people has transformed itself from one of the poorest in Europe in 1800 to one of the wealthiest in the world?
Socialism, obviously.
Obviously, socialism. But we need to go back nearly 300 years ago to find out where it all started, to the father of Nordic liberalism, Anders Chydenius. And I reckon I got this guy's name. I reckon I pronounced that well. Chydenius.
You think? Yeah.
I'm going to call him Chido. I reckon everyone probably called him Chido, so we're going to go with that.
The Chidester.
So Chido was born in 1729 and was a priest and politician, and his goal was to fight for the right of peasant farmers to sell their produce as they saw fit, meaning freedom of labour and property. Sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Chido knew that to accomplish this amazing feat of economic freedom, all citizens needed to gain political freedom. So in 1765, old mate Chido was elected to the Swedish parliament where his party took control. And because of his leadership, Sweden became the first country in the world to add freedom of the press to its constitution.
Oh, I bet he was tainted at the time as a populist, was he?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, this was a full 25 years before America's Bill of Rights. Not many people know that. But the bigwigs in his party were sick of Chido getting all the attention, and it probably didn't help that he continually criticised their monetary policy, so they booted him out in 1766. Only lasted a year in Parliament. 6 years later, in 1772, a coup by King Gustav III kicked out all the bludger politicians and ended this silly business of parliamentary democracy.
Terrible idea.
Yeah. But in his wisdom, old mate Gusti recalled Chido to court, and after a brief smoko, they got to work in what Gusti called enlightened despotism.
Yeah.
I wonder if
that's a contradiction in terms.
Yeah, I think that's what AOC's running on, isn't that her campaign slogan?
Yeah, it's not how she would put it, but it's probably accurate.
Yeah. So Chido led reforms in the King's new court to increase civil liberties and economic freedom, and he also abolished torture as a means of interrogation. And he also convinced the king to let the Jews and Christians freely immigrate into the country.
Not the juice.
He let the Jews in. But after a few years, Gusti cracked the shits with Chido and sent him packing. And Chido retired to the bush, where he spent his final 15 years. I don't know what he did in his last 15 years, but...
Probably didn't practice free market economics.
No. He probably owned peasants. Maybe a sort of George Washington type character who had slaves. When he died in 1803 at the age of 73, almost none of his economic reforms had taken hold, which must have sucked for him. His whole life work down the drain. Yeah. And Swedes continued to bail on Sweden because, in the words of Donald Trump, it was a massive shithole. And besides Chido's legacy of freedom, wealth and liberalism, which took hold of the entire Nordic region for hundreds of years to the modern day, he is most fondly remembered for this famous saying, "She's got an ass like a 12-year-old Swedish boy."
Seriously?
I probably need to check my sources on that one. I didn't know how that one was going to play. Not great by the look on your face. You weren't expecting that, were you?
It doesn't seem to fit in there.
No.
And don't forget to visit us at men2podcast.com, where you can find links to all our content via your favourite podcast app.
So during the early 1800s, things continued to go further up shit creek for the Swedes, but Chido's ideas started to gather momentum through a newspaper called the Aftonbladet. But once again, old mate King Gusti was a massive prick and decided to shut down the paper repeatedly. But the Aftonbladet continued to print under a new name each time because they just didn't give a fuck.
I reckon you got the pronunciation on that one wrong.
Aftonbladet?
Well. Yeah.
Should it be Bladet?
I don't know. No, that's French.
Aftonbladet. That's more Russian sound. How do you think it sounds? It's spelled Aftonbladet.
Because I see that same word in Swedish papers today, and
you read Swedish newspapers?
No, but I listen to the Angry Foreigner YouTube channel. It's fantastic. I don't know. Who cares?
The paper's still around today.
I don't know if that paper's that word.
Yeah, no, that newspaper is still around today.
It still is.
Yep.
Is it right?
Yep. Where were we? So in 1848, King Oscar the Grouch appoints the entrepreneur and free trade advocate Johann August Grippenstedt. How was that?
Oh, that was
better?
good. You got some good German going on.
Grippenstedt, yeah, that was a bit Germanic. And Grippo proceeds to kick off the liberal revolution of the 1840s, where they moved to an open market economy and guilds and regulations were abolished. So what do you reckon happened when they did that?
There was much flourishing.
There was flourishing, huge flourishment. Is that a word? Is flourishment a word?
Flourishment. I doubt it. You just made that up.
I made it
you
up.
Just coined
I made up a lot of stuff in this, to be fair. So during this time, Sweden became one of the richest countries in the world. And between 1850 and 1950, GDP increased over 700% and household income increased over 10 times. Infant mortality dropped 85% and life expectancy increased 26 years. It was open and deregulated with a lower tax than most countries. It's pretty amazing what happens when the government doesn't get involved in anything, doesn't it?
Oh, I'm so surprised.
That's a big surprise. And with this newfound wealth, they built big, beautiful cities, which you can still see today, plus there are loads of hot blonde Sheilas. And by all accounts, it was a bloody beaut place to live. So we get to the 1960s. That's when you were born, Is it?
No,
60s?
no, I'm
60s.
not that old.
No,
It's a
not
bit
old.
before
You're
my
not a
time.
flower child.
I am not a flower child.
parents were
I'm
hippies,
a
VW
child
combi.
of bad wallpaper. That's the 70s. You know those bad wallpaper.
Yeah, no, I remember.
patterns?
Were they a bit fairy as well? Did you have the
No,
fairy? I had some fairy
I
stuff in
didn't-
your house.
No.
Did you have the beads hanging down from the
velour
door?
carpet? Oh god, I
The
think we had
beads.
those on the back door. Yeah.
Yeah. Couldn't afford a door, so you just put beads instead. Fuck, we're old. So in the 60s anyway, this is about the time when the Swedes started thinking about spending all of their newfound wealth on a welfare state. And according to Nima Sanandaji, I got that one right. I practiced that one a lot. Yeah. Nima Sanandaji, who wrote the book Debunking Utopia, he wrote, a common misconception is that the Nordic countries became socially and economically successful by introducing universal welfare states funded by high taxes. But in fact, their economic and social success had already materialized during a period when these countries combined a small public sector with free market policies. The welfare state was introduced afterwards.
Yeah.
So funded by money that was made before.
Well, it's typical because the redistributionists don't show up until there's something to redistribute, right?
That's right. So in the 70s, Sweden was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, which is an amazing feat given their population was less than 10 million people. But as history has proven time after time, people in power with lots of money become massive fuckheads. And the unions with the backing of the government envisioned a welfare state where every prick could take a 10-year smoko and get paid for it.
Yes.
Healthcare, education, welfare and pensions were provided by the government, funded by massive hikes in taxes. And during this time, the government spending more than doubled, and taxes in certain sectors were doubled or even tripled.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened? What do you think happened next? If you had to guess.
I think they had to wind some of this back.
Because?
Because they were going to send themselves bankrupt.
Well, you would be right. The taxes weren't enough to fund all of this newfound welfare. So instead of reducing the welfare state, they introduced an employer's fee, which was a hidden tax paid by companies regardless of profitability.
Oh, this was a good one.
Yeah. And it was 12.5% of employees' wages. And surprise, surprise, by 1979, that tax had tripled to nearly 40%.
Jesus Christ.
Regardless of profitability.
And let's hear about what they did with it.
Yes, well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. But we've got a few more examples of how that screwed a few people over. Astrid Lindgren, the Pippi Longstocking author. You heard Pippi Longstocking? Yeah. She famously paid 102% tax in 1976. Imagine getting that tax bill in the mail.
That is awesome.
Yep. Because she was self-employed and she had to pay both personal income tax and the employer fee tax. And in response, she wrote a satirical children's story critical of the government's economic policies, which was called, and I'm gonna mess this up, Pomperi Possa in Monismania.
I think you did pretty well with
I reckon
that.
I got it out without spitting all over everything. Which I believe roughly translates to, please take your dick out of my ass, Mr. Government. Google Translate's kind of screwed me on this article, on this research, I think.
How did ABBA do? They must have done poorly as well. They must be paying like just about everything out that they earned. I mean, they were killing it.
Oh,
back
they were
then.
probably based in the US by that stage, though.
Think so?
Yeah, they were probably getting taxed in the US.
All I remember is on the front of the album cover, they were in a helicopter, so I don't know where that was.
That was them escaping 133% taxes.
There you go. That's what it was.
Yeah. And so anyway, Astrid's story was printed in newspapers all over Sweden, and it was a big factor, apparently, in the Social Democrats losing control in the elections coming up. And another one was Ingmar Bergman, the famous movie director, who paid 139% tax during his time, and he was actually arrested because he didn't pay it.
Oh, God.
So he pissed off to Germany.
As you would.
And he famously said in an interview that the taxes were stifling business and entrepreneurs, and excessive taxation suffocates the economy. I think 139% tax is not excessive.
But what is 130? That's his, like, that was his the highest tax rate? I mean, he
had to pay 139% of his income in tax.
That's what it literally means.
That's what it literally means.
Jesus
he had to pay
Christ.
more than he earned.
So for his hard work, he actually had to pay the government for his hard work.
Maybe they just didn't like his movies.
That's criminal.
Yeah.
That
Now,
is criminal.
here's the best bit about this. And around this time, the good blokes at the labour unions planned to acquire ownership of private companies. So every company had to pay a profit tax to investment funds which were owned by the unions. And unbelievably, the investment funds used this money to acquire shares back into the very same companies that had paid the tax.
You mean unions didn't use the money appropriately, efficiently?
I know it's surprising.
Are you kidding me?
I'm not surprising. So they actually used that money to buy back the companies that had paid them the taxes.
That's awesome.
And obviously a large part of the population was like, that's fucking bullshit. And so on October 4th, 1983, the largest demonstration in Sweden's history took place in Stockholm with over 100,000 people hitting the streets. And negotiations between unions and companies failed, so the politicians got involved. It's kind of surprising it took them this long to get involved, to be honest.
Yeah. But I just think about all that wasted money.
Yeah.
All the people's money that they earn is
So
down the toilet.
Yeah, so between 1976 and 1995, Sweden's economic growth was half that of first world nations. Thank you, socialism.
Thanks, Bernie.
Yep. Inflation was high at 10% and interest rates soared to 500%. And many big companies moved overseas, including IKEA, who relocated to Switzerland. And people were basically being punished for starting businesses. And here's another interesting stat. Between 1950 and 2005, Sweden did not add one net private sector job. Though Nordic socialism had frozen a once entrepreneurial and prosperous people in time. Yay, socialism, yay. So fast forwarding through to the 90s, and entrepreneurs had bailed in huge numbers. Taxes consumed 60% of GDP and the nation's economy was stuffed. Business taxes sometimes exceeded 100%. I find that a little bit high, to be honest.
Just a smidge.
Yeah. But along comes Carl Bildt, who we mentioned earlier as the top bloke who slagged off Bernie Sanders. And he became the first non-social democrat prime minister in 6 decades. I think it's surprising it took him 30 years to vote out the government who did nothing about socialism. Well, I guess the Swedes are just a bit slow to move. Captain Bildt cut capital gains tax to 30% and corporate taxes to 28%. And the top marginal tax rate fell from nearly 90% to 50%. And he privatised a lot of state-owned industries and introduced school vouchers and allowed people to invest a portion of their pension.
I mean, that's roughly equivalent where Australia is today. I mean, I think top marginal tax rate is 47, 50. But then you throw in Medicare.
No,
levy.
It's 49.
49, then you throw in Medicare. Levy.
Oh, and you forgot the 2%, what is it, the 2% deficit levy.
Oh, yeah, deficit levy, which is just stealing your money because
they spend too much. Yeah, it's golden.
And our corporate tax rate, you said that they cut it to 28, ours is 30.
I think ours is, around 30.
No, ours is 30, but
yeah, it's actually, Sweden's is actually less now. It's actually around 22. So, so old mate Carl Bildt, he said at the time, the age of collectivism is now at an end. Strong words. But the short-term pain of Bildt's reforms led to him losing the next election and returned the Social Democrats back into office in 94. But his successor, Ingvar Carlsson, I reckon that one.
Yeah.
I reckon nailed that one. He maintained his market-friendly reforms.
It's a pretty easy one, Carlsson.
Ingvar. Oh, come on, Ingvar. It's a G and a V. How does a G and V work together? Ingvar. Ingvar Carlsson. Yeah, he maintained his market-friendly reforms and a new entrepreneurial Sweden emerged. So the Social Democrats learned after 60 years of fucking things up. After 4 years of a conservative politician coming in and cleaning everything up, they took back power again.
Yeah, and they went, he was probably right.
Yeah,
did not fuck this up.
Yeah.
Just wait 20, 30 years. The collective memory will be gone and they'll just go back to their old tricks.
Yep. So since the 90s to the modern day, Sweden's GDP has tripled and inflation's down from 10% to 1%. Government debt has decreased from 66% of GDP to 40%. And the government has run a surplus every year from 1990 except 2003 and 2004. Unemployment's 11% to 7%, which is still higher than the US. And the Index of Economic Freedom ranked Sweden as the 19th most free out of 179 countries.
Right. So not exactly socialist.
No, not exactly, but also not the most free market. But then again, Hong Kong's number one on that list.
Yeah.
So I'm not really sure
Where's
how
Singapore?
relevant. Oh, I think it's number 2.
Right.
Yeah.
Where are we?
We're ahead of Sweden. I think we were number 14 or 15.
Okay. So, I mean, the argument to move towards socialism wouldn't actually move us very far in terms of winding back a little bit of economic freedom.
Well, I mean, I guess really what it tells you is there isn't a whole lot of economic freedom in any country.
Yeah.
I mean, Hong Kong, how much economic freedom do you think they have now that they're run by China?
Well, I mean, maybe that's changing. I don't know how old that data is, but they had a hell of a lot of economic
last
freedom.
year.
Was it last year?
Yeah.
But China has surprisingly taken a bit of a hands-off approach there to their economically.
Yep.
Because I think, why ruin a good thing there? It does fine.
As long as you're not bagging China.
Yeah.
Probably works well.
I think, yeah, exactly.
Well, you'd be happy to know that Sweden has a very high gender equality and lower income equality than most countries. And it also has high quality, low cost, but mostly privatised healthcare.
But these gender equality measures, for a start, they're nonsense. But they have higher occupational segregation than we have.
That's
right. For example, you have a look at engineers or something. I mean, they can't budge the number beyond about 10 or 15%.
I think same with nursing as well. I think
they throw heaps of money at it. Now they've got these genderless preschools and things. They just keep doubling down. Oh, we got to do more. We got to do more. That's always the answer, right? It's not working. It's not working. We just got to throw more money at it. Go more radical. But somehow I think biology will still win out.
I think it will indeed. So the success of the Nordic countries is not really big government or socialism. It's because of free markets and capitalism, which enable them to provide high-cost social welfare. And without economic growth, there is no wealth to share. That's kind of reasonable, isn't it?
Yeah. As I said before, I mean, the redistributionists never come in when there's nothing to redistribute, do they? I mean, they come in and go. They usually, it's always the same. It's resentment based. That's not fair. The guy over there's got a lot, and the guy over there doesn't. It must be, again. It's leaping to conclusions with no evidence. It must be because that guy's, oppressing everybody. He's got slaves. He's got white privilege. Whatever it is, whatever the new, reason de jure, it's 2019 reason is. Let's pull that one out. But it's the same. It's resentment based. It's no one ever looks at it and goes, "No, wait a minute. That guy's wealth actually does filter down through the jobs he creates." AOC, whoever chief of staff is running around on his Twitter account, says something like, "The fact that there's billionaires is a policy mistake." That's not perfect. I don't have it in front of me. Yeah, but that's what it basically, the existence of billionaires demonstrates that there's something wrong.
Isn't that guy multi-millionaire? He was a founder of Stripe, and isn't he under investigation now for laundering millions of dollars to a private LLC from one of the super PACs?
He's not a billionaire. He's only a multi-millionaire.
Yeah, well, he's only a multi-millionaire. How dare he? So anyway, everything is not that peachy in the Nordic countries, surprisingly. They face quite a few issues with the welfare state model. Most recently, the Finnish government had to resign because they couldn't get reforms to healthcare through their Congress. So they just up and resigned.
Yep.
So they just quit, walked away. But under huge financial pressure, the government tried to reorganise the welfare state to reduce its costs by $3.4 billion over the next 10 years. But nobody voted for it. And Sweden's open immigration policy has not been popular with many new migrants not integrating due to rigid labour regulations and vast welfare benefits, which encourages people to sit home all day and watch Netflix.
Yeah, I wonder why those millions of people came through Africa and through Europe.
Sounds good, though.
Home,
just sitting at home watching Netflix all day.
Yeah,
just getting money.
Why not? I mean, you're coming from a country that's poor, that you don't know where your next meal's coming from, and you just show up. Hey, Angela will let us into Germany, and we can sit around watching Angela.
Who's Angela?
Merkel.
Oh, you're talking about Germany. Okay, right.
Well, I'm just using it as an example. Yep. I mean, why not? All of these countries have very good welfare states. We do too.
And of course, who are these people going to vote for at the next election?
Yeah.
Are they going to vote for the people who keep the welfare going, or are they going to vote for the
other? It speaks to the problem of entitlements, where once you bring it in, it's almost impossible to remove it because people actually think that they're entitled to it. Remember that David Lionel, one of his key achievements was getting through legislation through the parliament that childcare subsidies were basically going to anyone. Doesn't matter how much money you earn. I mean, you're getting taxpayer subsidies. You had a $2 million income, you were getting a subsidy from the government for childcare. Now, he cut that back to households with income under $350,000, which is still way too high.
Yeah.
But, that's what he did. And there was a woman that wrote into the Sydney Morning Herald like an op-ed and complained about how she had been cheated. She was entitled to this. So this is a woman with a household income over $350,000. I mean, that's the level of entitlement.
Well, I think the easy argument to that is to say to her, look, you're probably getting taxed at 50%. How about we reduce your tax to 40%, but you don't get any free money anymore?
Yeah. Well, Lib Dems had a flat 20% tax rate and a
I love it.
$40,000 tax-free threshold.
I love it.
Not taxed on your first 40 grand.
No one's going to vote for it. No one's going to vote for it.
No one's going to vote for it. You know why? Because it means cutting.
All the free shit. All the free shit's gone. Oh, and that too. Yeah. So back to the problems in the Nordic region. Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway all rank in the top 12 countries for antidepressant use.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that just the climate?
Yeah, well, it might be the long winters, and I've experienced that. I lived in Finland for a few months, and it does suck.
Were you there because don't they have this thing where they open their windows and just scream one day?
Oh, yeah, I wasn't there for that.
You weren't there for that?
No,
yeah, they just
wish.
because like you have entire days in darkness.
I don't think Finnish people would do that. They're the most antisocial people I've ever met in my life. I think that would cause them to get on antidepressants.
You just caused our 3 Finnish subscribers to unsubscribe.
I'm sorry, Finland. I like your country, but you're pretty weird. Or maybe it's possible that a generous, far-reaching welfare state depletes people's sense of drive, purpose, and self-respect, and enables them to explore chemical forms.
Well, this is my biggest argument against UBI.
You think people are just going to sit around doing nothing all day?
Just bad incentives. Yeah, bad incentives.
All right, but let me ask you this though: if implementing a UBI meant that we could get rid of 80% of the government, would you do it? Yeah,
I still don't know because I don't believe that. Because every time, Charles Murray's made this point because he's actually a proponent of UBI. The problem is you say, here's a UBI and we're going to get rid of 80% of welfare payments. But of course, they don't do that, right? There's, no, we need to keep this one. Oh, and this one, and this one. So you end up with a UBI plus pretty much
plus
everything
all the other
else.
shit,
And you cut some things around the side.
Yep.
So, I guess I would agree with you in some sense. But it's sort of like just it's the best house in a bad neighbourhood kind of scenario. It's still not a great solution, I don't think. I don't like the incentives. I understand when people say, look, you get satisfaction by going to work and doing something. Yeah, but what if your job is just an absolute dead-end job that you hate? But, okay, well, what's the alternative then? So you just sit home, watch TV and, cleaning Cheeto dust out of your belly button. Whereas you watch Netflix. Is that it? How is that going to give you purpose? Is it going to free up your time such that you do have, are you going to take up, you always want to be a painter?
I thought maybe we could just have our own artisan bakery. We could have our own artisan bakery where we make vagina cupcakes and penis nipple cupcakes as well. Or maybe we just get back online and just start harassing people.
Yeah. I guess you got more time for that to get offended on Twitter. That is the thing, though.
Well, it seems like the better things get, the more likely people are just to sit around and complain about shit that is not really that important.
Well, that's the sort of the irony of sort of this taking offence at everything culture and thinking everything's awful is that it just demonstrates how good things are getting. If you think microaggressions are real, it just shows you have nothing to really complain about, does it?
Yep. Yeah. Well, anyway, getting back to Sweden. That was a nice tangent we went on there.
Yeah.
We are going to do the UBI episode coming up. We nearly launched into it right then. So what are the differences between the Sweden model and the Sanders model? Well, for starters, the Nordic countries are far more homogenous than the melting pot of the US. And when people tend to think along similar lines, it's much easier to get a consensus.
Yeah.
Do you really think you could get a consensus in the US about socialism?
No.
I think it'd be pretty hard.
No, it'd be pretty tough. Yeah, I lived in a country that's pretty homogenous. I lived in Japan. And you can get consensuses on a lot of things much easier.
Especially if you're old and male. And slightly balding. Yeah. Well, the Scandinavian model is capitalism with a strong democracy, low to moderate levels of government intervention in the market, and in fact one of the freest markets in the world, which includes a universal welfare state which is predominantly privatised. And this is the polar opposite to real socialism, which aims to redistribute the wealth and power in society through the redistribution of society's means of production. Socialism aims to balance the scales between the rich and the poor simply by stealing wealth from the rich.
That's it in a
That's
nutshell.
pretty much in a nutshell. That's socialism.
It takes you back to Scott Morrison, pushing people down to
Yep.
raise other people up. But what actually happens is that you end up pushing everybody down.
Yeah, that's right. Only free exchange between entrepreneurs and their resources can create actual goods and services that satisfy consumer needs and wants.
Yeah.
The government is not good at doing that.
Yeah, and they never actually address the idea that you can start redistributing the pie, but the whole point is you've got to continue to grow the pie. And once you start the redistribution, the pie doesn't grow anymore.
Yep.
Once you get to a certain point.
Everybody likes pie.
Everyone wants a bit of pie.
They do. Are we getting back to the cupcake thing now, or is that right? Okay. Anyway, socialists like Breadline Bernie, they take absolutely no part in this process of wealth creation. I don't think. But what do you think Bernie's ever done to create wealth for anyone besides himself?
Nothing, but he has created his own wealth because he's got three
Got a couple
houses.
of houses,
I
a
think,
couple of nice houses on the lake.
Yeah, and he's got
Yep.
a nice. I remember they said that he went to this rally where he's talking about how we need to redistribute there, and then he drove away in his brand new.
He obviously hasn't got enough money to buy a comb because he's there. He looks like he's touched one of those.
Well, yeah, if you go back to those, those quotes from the 80s and things, you actually see them online, him talking about it. He's never had a comb in his life by the looks of it.
Yeah.
Just never bothered.
Yeah. And let's not forget Bernie's wife, Jane Sanders, who racked up so much debt as president of Vermont's Burlington College that the school was forced to close down.
Hey, how can these people have political careers with just this wake of failure behind them? It's just, just go from one failure to the next.
I think AOC is pretty lucky she's managed to get in before she failed at life too bad. I mean,
exactly.
I think her only job was a bartender, wasn't it?
Yeah, I know she did that. I don't know what else she did, but yeah, you're right. She hasn't got a track record of failure behind it.
Yeah.
I did.
Well, she's racked up a few since she joined the.
I saw a headline the other day about how she was involved in a failed business or something. But yeah, maybe
Well, if that's what it takes to get into Parliament, then I'm a shoo-in. So I wanted to give our listeners a few points they could take away and use when in the face of purple-haired feminazis or 125-pound soy boys who are espousing the virtues of Swedish socialism or Bernie Sanders' presidential chances. And here's a couple of things you can do to disarm the debate. And I'm a big fan of making people look like morons by asking them open-ended questions and just letting them run their full mouths. So here's the first thing to ask. What actually is socialism? Chances are they'll say something like, it's when the government takes care of everyone, or it's what happens in Sweden. But you'll answer, no, socialism is when the government controls the means of production through regulation and taxes. And it's also responsible for the deaths of more than 260 million people in the 20th century, with the most famous examples being the Nazis, Mao's China, Stalin's Russia, and the Kim's North Korea. Now, typically that'll end any conversation, as most of these people can barely form a coherent argument besides what they've heard on CNN. But just in case they continue on their idiotic path, they'll probably say something like, but socialism has never been allowed to work properly. Or, but what about Sweden? And then you'll ask, how is Sweden actually a socialist country? And they'll talk about the welfare state and free education, high taxes and blah, blah, blah. But there's a pretty simple reply to all of that, and that is, how do they fund all of those programs? And they'll talk about taxing the rich and the wealthy corporations. But that's when you'll tell them that Swedish corporations are taxed at 22%.
Yeah,
which
one
is
of the lowest.
Lowest in the world. It's lower than the US and lower than most Western countries. And Sweden also has a flat personal income tax. It's not just the rich that's paying more, but it's everyone pays more. The bottom tier of workers pay around 32% in tax. And anyone earning 1.2 times more than the national average pays a whopping 52%, that's the highest rate in Australia, I think.
Yeah, when you add all the extras on,
Yep. But wait, there's more. Everyone pays 25% sales tax on goods and services. And this is when you deliver the Mike Tyson uppercut to the chin. Ask them, so how much more are you actually willing to pay in taxes?
Yeah.
To fund your new welfare state?